Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. This is the beginning of the 65th Annual Utah History Conference, titled Local Matters, Interweaving Historical Threads in Community. We are delighted to see so many of you today. The conference puts a close to a year of focus that the history of the state has been involved in, dealing with local history, with our local agencies and others, under the banner that local does truly matter when it comes to history. I want to note the passing in the last year of Chaz Peterson, a former director and Utah historian, and also a dear friend and fellow Carmen Hardy, who also passed away last year. My name is Brad Westwood, and I'm director of the Division of State History. Thank you for being a part of this program. I appreciate the generosity of many financial underwriters. Please join me in thanking them for the support, their wonderful support of this conference. Our conference is free because these organizations and individuals love Utah history and are invested in the mission of state history. We have today for you 30 panels and presentations for you to choose from. Now I know it's hard, and some of the things I hear from you in years past is, can you somehow assemble the sessions in some stringed order so I can attend the ones I really want to be to? It just can't happen. There's so much good new history here. I want to say that these 30 panels and presenters have all come and spent their time and prepared for you to enjoy today. I'd like to note one correction in the conference program. In the session on the impact of independent film on local communities, Jenny McKenzie's name was misspelled, and the correct name of her film is Dying in Vain, and we apologize for this error. Today's conference will examine the many strands that create the historic fabric of personal, family, and broader community history. Today we're here to enjoy, listen, and participate in a conversation about everyday experiences and lives. We all have stories that have contributed to the understanding of Utah's past. I now invite Dr. David Rich Lewis to introduce our panel. Dr. Lewis is an emeritus professor of history at Utah State University, is the former editor of the Western Historical Quarterly, and one of America's most respected, former editor of the Western Historical Quarterly, one of America's most respected academic journals. It's our honor to have him serve on our Board of State History. Dr. David Rich Lewis will introduce our panel today. Thank you, Dave.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this opening plenary session. So this year's conference builds really naturally from last year's, where we explored issues facing rural Utahns and how that informs the larger regional and national debates over economic development, land use, and life lived outside of the metropoles. Today we're here to discuss why that local matters matter, what community is, how it evolves, the conflict and diversity inherent in such groups, and how those local histories inform, again, our understanding of our state and beyond. It's appropriate then to begin historiographically in a way, by noting that many of Utah's most noted historians over the years focused their research through that local. Juanita Brooks, Dale Morgan, Bernard DeVoto, Wallace Stegner, Leonard Arrington, Fawn Brody, just to name a few of those who have passed. All of those used that focus on place or individuals, on the local, to tell stories of larger significance. And here I'm going to stop and I'm going to add Charles Peterson, who passed away earlier this year. Many of you knew Chaz. He was a man from a place so local he called it Belly Button, the center spot between Snow and Flake, Arizona. Chaz left the farm. He earned his degrees. He taught for a decade at Carbon College in Price. He directed the Utah State Historical Society. He edited the Quarterly. He became a leader in the American Association for State and Local History, and he ended up as editor of the Western Historical Quarterly at Utah State University, where I had the good fortune to be mentored by him. But Chaz never really left the farm. He never really left Belly Button. He never left the local. The focus of his scholarship and his way of explaining his people and his place went on throughout his career. He admired Bernard DeVoto's technique of approaching history through synecdoche, using the part to represent the whole, or the whole to illustrate something unseen in the particular. This is what he knew in his bones, that local matters mattered, and he passed that on through his teaching, his scholarship, his friendship to all that came in touch with him. So today, we're going to hear from a new generation of scholars about why local and community history matters, and perhaps to hear some of the perils in the telling of those histories. So I'm going to introduce the panel and then step back and let them turn them loose. And then after they present, we'll open it up to you for comments, discussion, and questions. We'll proceed alphabetically. So Elizabeth Clement, University of Pennsylvania PhD, an associate professor of history and affiliated with the Gender Studies program at the University of Utah. Her first book, Love for Sale, won the 2001 Ryan Dixon Fox Prize from the New York State Historical Society. She currently has 2 book projects underway related to her presentation today. The first, a monograph, We Are Family, Gays and Lesbians in the American Family. And the second part of a larger multidisciplinary effort to create a permanent archival collection on HIV/AIDS in Utah, titled AIDS and the Silent Majority, Family, Religion, Care in Conservative America. Dr. Clement is a 9-time award-winning teacher and honors professor at the U, and I look forward to hearing about her work on these communities. Ben Pykles earned a PhD in anthropology with an emphasis on historical archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania. After teaching at the State University of New York in Potsdam, he joined the LDS Church History Department as a historic sites curator in 2011, where he helps envision, develop, interpret, and manage 24 historic sites. Dr. Pykles is an author of Excavating Nauvoo, The Mormons and the Rise of Historical Archaeology in America, which won the 2011 Best First Book Award from the Mormon History Association. He's taught archaeology at BYU, is the chair of the history committee within the Society for American Archaeology. And during his early years, this professorship in New York, Dr. Pykles researched and conducted archaeological excavations at Yosefa, the turn-of-the-century Mormon Pacific Islander colony in Skull Valley, which will form the bulk of his presentation today. Dr. Gergory E. Smoak, director of the American West Center and associate professor of history at the University of Utah, specializes in American Indian, Western, environmental, and public history. A University of Utah PhD, he taught at Minnesota and Colorado State before returning to Utah in 2010. His first book, Ghost Dances and Identity, Prophetic Religion, An American Indian Ethnogenesis in the 19th Century, was published by the University of California Press in 2006. And his most recent book, A Public Environmental History of the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, is forthcoming from the University of Oklahoma. Dr. Smoak has partnered in research projects with the Shoshone-Bannock, Ute Mountain Ute, Big Sandy Rancheria, Navajo Nation, as well as the Nevada Indian Commission and the Utah Division of Indian Affairs. And he's currently principal investigator on 3 projects with the National Park Service, all experiences that will inform his presentation today. So with that, let me begin by turning it over to our panel for their comments.
Okay, does that work? All right, I'm gonna have to lean in. Oh, maybe I'll do this. Are we good?
Okay. I'd like to apologize. I am actually going to read my comments, and I'm going to read them off my computer because we don't have a working printer at home. And I do apologize, but we were asked to limit our comments to 5 to 10 minutes, and as academics, we don't do that well. So
we'll keep
if I read things, yeah, I'm actually better about staying on time, and this should be less than 10 minutes. So I'm writing a history of HIV in Utah, and broadly I argue that paradoxically AIDS actually increased the acceptance of homosexuality in the United States and in Utah, and particularly in conservative places. Which is to say, I'm off-roading already, okay? Which is to say that we know an awful lot about both the gay community and about HIV/AIDS in big places like San Francisco and New York, but that does not actually explain how it is that homosexuality has made such strides in acceptance in the broader US context, because most places that people live in the United States are not San Francisco. And so understanding San Francisco does not actually explain that movement. San Francisco was already a very liberal place in many ways before HIV/AIDS hit. So as a result, community, and here I'm doing what I was asked to do, which is to talk about community and the local, defined as gay, and community defined as the LDS Church, or what my narrators like to call the dominant community or the mainstream community, are both constantly at play in my research. Sorry. Okay. So first, ideas about community, what it is, who's in it, how it might be bounded by geography or not, shaped the AIDS epidemic in the United States and particularly locally, literally causing more HIV infections than necessary. As Ted Fairchild, a gay man working for the state health department in the early 1980s, explained when he gave a keynote at the American Public Health Association Congress in Denver in 1992, quote, "I have AIDS today partly because those responsible for epidemiology and disease prevention in my state decided in 1983 that this disease could not be a problem in our community." Our community, in that definition then, according to the state health department, was straight. This puzzled Fairchild, quote, "I cannot understand how someone could decide that the, quote, gay plague would not affect their community, a community where there were at least 7 gay bars and 2 bathhouses. Public health leaders allowed their personal belief systems to influence their decision regarding disease." And here he emphasizes personal belief systems, but another way to think about it is their definition of community. Do we have homosexuals here? We don't, therefore this homosexual disease won't affect us. So ignoring AIDS as a public health crisis allowed it to spread. AIDS is preventable. It's relatively easy to prevent in some ways, but you need to know how to do that. And in many ways, that is actually a national story. It's not unique to Utah. Federal, state, and local governments across the country responded very, very slowly to the epidemic, precisely because it was associated with debased queerness. And queers had not been able successfully to claim the rights of citizenship and therefore resources from the state by the early 1980s, which is to say, of course, they were citizens, but they were not always treated as citizens by their state and seen as people who deserved resources. Instead, both nationally and locally, private philanthropy and nonprofits responded to the epidemic first. In 1988, the newly founded Utah AIDS Foundation won a 4-year, $100,000 each year Robert Wood Johnson grant that allowed it to hire staff to run its expanding prevention and care programs. And just in time, as it turns out, because caseloads doubled from each year from 1988 to 1993. This attitude expressed by Utah's State Department of Public Health defined community in 2 interesting ways. And I've already talked about how it assumes that all people in Utah are straight. But also, it assumed that Utah was not part of a region or a part of the nation. From their perspective, Utah was isolated, in a positive way, from corrupting influences from the outside. They assumed then that national issues would not affect their local community. Not surprisingly, my research reveals that both Utah and its gay community are embedded both in a nation and in a region. From the 1950s onward, the US had a, quote, national gay community sustained and connected through nationally circulating journals that arrived in brown paper wrappers with ambiguous return addresses. My oral histories reveal that in Utah, most queer people's first knowledge of AIDS was not through knowing someone who was sick, but instead through reading one of the national gay papers, or in the case of Ben Barr, the founder of the Utah AIDS Foundation, through a nationally circulating pornography magazine that contained, as Playboy also did, serious articles, in this case on this new gay cancer. A national community then warned the local community about the coming storm. Utah and its gay community were also part of a region. Local gays often went to Denver, Los Angeles, or San Francisco, mostly San Francisco, for vacation. Many moved for a time to these cities precisely because the national gay press circulated here and showed them that they could be more open about their sexuality in bigger regional cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles. As Richard Starley, one of the founders of AIDS Project Utah, explains, quote, "Here people assume that you were a sinner, that you were a bad person, but that wasn't true in San Francisco," unquote. The regionalism and mobility of people in Utah in the late 20th century, of course, is one of the reasons why we ended up with an epidemic here. Or to put it another way, there is such a thing as local, but by the late 20th century, that local was not isolated from either the region or the nation. But those regional community connections were also what saved us when AIDS came. In 1984, the future founders of AIDS Project Utah and the Salt Lake AIDS Foundation both moved to, independently, didn't know each other, moved to the Bay Area for sabbaticals. They witnessed the epidemic unfolding there and studied models of prevention and care. Realizing that regional patterns of travel for work, education, and leisure would bring AIDS to Utah, they brought San Francisco's community-based model of AIDS response back to Utah. In 1985, AIDS Project Utah created a buddy program to support the dying, and people from San Francisco came out to train them. The Salt Lake AIDS Foundation, also in 1985, created a hotline and a speakers bureau providing AIDS education for anyone who asked. Interestingly, at least half of the calls that hotline received came from straight people, indicating that by 1985, even straight people in Utah had begun to realize that AIDS was here. The connections that local people had to their region then made the response to the epidemic more robust and more effective. Connections with physicians at San Francisco General and UCSF kept Dr. Reese, who was our AIDS doctor in Utah, apprised of new treatments. That we had patients enrolled in clinical trials for antiretroviral drugs as early as 1993 lessened the impact of AIDS here. Antiretrovirals bring your viral load down so low that you are no longer infectious, and of course they also, if you can tolerate them, basically make you healthy. So the fact that we had people in these trials as early as 1993 means that we had less AIDS here than we would have had. Antiretrovirals go on the market for everybody else in 96. And this, the fact that we had this is a direct result of the regional professional ties that Dr. Reese had to San Francisco. Initially, the gay community responded alone and without help from the, quote, dominant community. The UAF did not receive funding from the state of Utah until 1992, despite the fact that it had a caseload of 329 people. Dr. Reese ran her practice out of Holy Cross Hospital because the nuns were dedicated to treating anyone in need, and until 1989, when the U finally opened a small clinic, no other hospital would take people with AIDS in the state. For most of the 1990s, no other doctor would treat people with HIV. The response then of the medical community was very poor to the epidemic. As Patty Reagan, the founder of the Salt Lake AIDS Foundation, said, quote, "I mean, the gay community was the only one taking care of the gay community. Health departments wouldn't, the government wouldn't, nobody would. There was no choice." Over time, though, the idea that within the dominant community that homosexuality and AIDS did not happen here, that we did not have homosexuals within our dominant community, lessened. AIDS brought homosexuality into the home and into the ward as young men came back to die. As Stan Penfold, the current director of the Utah AIDS Foundation, explained, quote, "And so one of the things we saw a lot were young men coming home in their final days to be taken care of, even though the family could not come to terms with their sexual orientation. Or, as Nikki Boyer, a local lesbian activist and bartender, noted, quote, "When it was your son and your brother who were dying, that put a human face on it. Let's face it," she continued, "those boys were here. The majority of them came from good Mormon families. So it was touching everybody one way or another." This project then is about how communities define community and why that matters. So obviously I began with an argument that ignoring a part of the community actually made the epidemic worse, changed things, but also how communities change their definition of community over time. I think that most people living in Utah today would be hard-pressed to argue that we have no homosexuals in our community, and thus that things that affect homosexuality will not affect us.
Thank you. That is very interesting. I see some parallels with the work that I've done at Yosepa. I want to thank Brad Westwood and Holly George and Jed Woodworth for inviting me to participate on this panel, and it's an honor to be here with Elizabeth and Greg and David as well. So is my first slide on there? I can't see there. A map of Utah with the town site of Yosepa. Great. So what I'd like to do just briefly here to begin is tell you how I got into what archaeology calls community archaeology. I started this project not intending to do this, and I kind of fell into it through a series of fortunate mistakes, I guess you could say. And so there are some lessons to be learned from my missteps and my the journey I took, and I hope that it will serve to illustrate some of the principles that apply to any local history project or community history project. For those of you that don't know Yosepa, it's pretty much, well, it's an archaeological site now. It used to be a thriving town in the late 19th and early 20th century, founded by converts to Mormonism from the Pacific Islands. And it's always interesting to note to Utah residents and others that there were Mormons in the South Pacific before there were Mormons in the Great Basin. The first Mormon missionaries left from Nauvoo in Illinois in 1842 to go to the South Pacific, some 4 or 5 years before they arrived in the Great Basin. So Mormonism has a long history in the Pacific Islands, and once the Hawaiian government released or lifted their immigration ban, they came flooding into the Utah territory in the late 19th century. And at first they settled in North Salt Lake area, kind of the Warm Springs area, and then after a while it became clear that they were not being well integrated into the white Mormon community, and so a committee of 3 Pacific Islanders and 3 Anglo Mormons they formed a committee and went looking for a place to, a new home, if you will, in the territory for the Pacific Islanders, and they ultimately settled here in the Skull Valley, where that red star is indicated on the map there of Utah. And they established a community that at its height reached about 230 individuals. It lasted from 1889 to 1917. When you go there today, there's really very little left of that community in terms of its physical traces. The most prominent thing is the cemetery, which you can see there in the upper right-hand corner of the far right image. There are a number of Pacific Islanders buried there. Some of them died from leprosy, others just from old age or other sicknesses of the time. So I was a newly minted PhD in 2006, and I knew I had just been hired by the State University of New York at Potsdam to be an assistant professor, and I knew I needed to run a field school, an opportunity for students to learn how to do archaeology. And I've always been interested in, academically, in the issues of cultural persistence and change when 2 different communities come together. And in particular, when Mormonism, the community of Mormonism, meets up with other ethnic communities. And in this was a wonderful opportunity, I felt, to study that, kind of research that question. What happens to both Mormonism and to Pacific Island cultures when they come together, when they meet up? And so I set out to start a project, a traditional archaeological project. And the first thing, I knew it was on private land, so the first thing I had to do was go meet the landowner. So thank heavens for Google, even back then. I was able to find out who the landowner was, make contact with him, and arrange a meeting. And so we sat down, I explained to him what I was interested in, what I wanted to do on his property, and he was very favorable to the idea. And I asked him at that time if he knew of any descendants of the Yosepa saints that I might talk to learn more about the community. And he put me in touch with a group that at the time I thought this was the only descendant community. This is one of the first lessons that I learned, is that there are often more than one descendant community, and you better find out who they all are before you get yourself into trouble. So I started meeting with this one group, and they were very excited about the research I was proposing and the things that they felt I could offer to their understanding of the community and their ancestors. But it wasn't long before I discovered that there was another group, and actually a larger group, a more active group, and that this other group was kind of, they didn't get along. And it became very clear that this other group was very angry at me and did not, they didn't trust me. They thought I was subversive to their goals and their objectives and wishes. And I found myself in the middle of a political battle, if you will, for who was going to control access to the story of Yosepa. And this is a problem that I think many people that do local history or community archaeology find themselves in. It's not an apolitical process, as we know all history is not that. And it's not without conflict and tension. And so what did I do? Well, I was young and naive and a little bit scared about what was happening. I was finding myself embroiled in this debate, this battle. So I went and talked to actually someone in state history, Matt Seddon, who used to be the Deputy Historic Preservation Officer. He's no longer with the state history, but Matt gave me some really good advice. And Matt and I didn't know each other very well, but I had been talking to him about this project, and he said, you know what, you need to go talk to that other group. You need to go make a presentation to them, tell them what you're all about, what you hope to accomplish, and admit that you made a mistake. Just fall on your sword. Tell them that you were wrong, and ask for their forgiveness even, and tell them that you're here to learn from them. I said, okay, that sounds worth a shot. So we set up a meeting time down at the Kalama Mohalo Foundation in Midvale, and made my presentation and opened it up for questions and answers at the end. And wouldn't you know, of course, the very first person to stand up was also a graduate student in Native Hawaii history at the University of Minnesota, and she just reamed me, just lit me up one side and down the other. Who are you coming in here, a white man, telling us what our history is all about, and you have no right doing, it was intense. And, the natural inclination is to fight back and kind of, justify yourself. But I took Matt's advice and I just said, look, your concerns are legitimate, and I'm grateful that you would express them to me. I made a mistake. I did not know about your group, and I'm glad that I do now. That's why I'm here, and I really am anxious to learn from you and work together on understanding this community. She sat down, and then the others started standing up, and the others were very, very supportive and very, very gracious. In fact, afterwards they came up and kind of apologized for the way that other person had treated me, because by and large, all of the Pacific Islanders that I've met are very gracious people. And so that was a key moment in this project in terms of the beginnings of forging the relationships that the project succeeded on, if you will. And that's another principle that I hope to communicate today, is that this type of local history, this community archaeology, if you will, is based on relationships of respect and trust. And as an academic or as a scholar, you have to be humble enough to, and again, I'm not very good at this, but you have to be humble enough to relinquish control to some degree of your research agenda, and recognize that you're not the only expert when it comes to studying a particular group's history, that they have legitimate and valid things to contribute and offer you just as much as you may have things to offer them. What was really fantastic, let's see, I have a clicker here.
Do it.
Did that work?
No.
It's not going to click on my slide. Did that work? No? There it is, okay. So this is one of the few images that exist of the Osepa Latter-day Saints, and this is actually one that's in the Utah State Library, History and Library Archives. And what I found interesting about this image and others like it is that you see that there is a diversity of individuals, even in the 19th century there at Osepa. You see some Anglo Mormons, you see a lot of different Pacific Islanders, and what I've learned as I've gone through this project is that the relationships existed then just like they need to exist now. And the success of the town, if you want to say it was successful, was built on those same relationships that made this project successful to the extent that it was. Anyhow, after that presentation down in Midvale, I kind of asked the question, so now what? What's next? And I was incredibly touched. Can we go to the next slide?
You can try.
Did that work? Okay. What they proposed was something that blew me away. Even though I'd been trained in anthropology, I never expected to find myself in this situation. But they said, we need to go to the site and we need to have what they called an Olli Ceremony, which is basically a prayer ceremony. So we agreed upon a day and a time. It was an early Saturday morning. We went out to the site, and they were dressed in their traditional clothing, and they chanted, and they prayed, and they sang in their native tongues. Basically, when I asked them afterwards what they were saying, they were praying to their ancestors, many of whom were buried in the cemetery before them, telling them to not be angry with me, and to say that it was okay, that what I was going to be doing was going to be okay, and it was going to help the community in the end. And they presented gifts, gifts from the islands actually, in these beautifully carved gourds, full of foods from the islands. And this was a very, traditional ceremony, kind of a healing ceremony to mend the rift that I unintentionally created in my naivete. And so again, this was a wonderful way to start this project. And again, I had not intended to do any of this. It just kind of happened to me as I stepped into this situation as an outsider, trying to study another community that I am genuinely interested in. Over the years, those relationships have just flourished. Another principle that I think is really important for any local historian or community archaeologist is that these kinds of projects take a lot of time and a lot of effort in just building these relationships. You have to kind of commit to the long term here, because if you go in like a traditional anthropologist did in the 19th century, and your goal is just extract their secrets so that they can benefit you in your tenure process or whatever it is you're about, that's not going to work. That's the old colonial ways, and you need to genuinely see the people that you're working with as genuine collaborators and equal partners in the research, and again, be humble enough to know that they have something to offer you just as much as you have something to offer them. I'm going to stop at that. I've got some other stories that we can share, maybe if the questions point us that direction, but it's been a wonderful project, and it's something that I cherish dearly. My friends at Osepa are some of my dearest friends, and I love them, and I think they love me now too. Thank you.
See if this works, or do I have to get that close to it?
You just got to be a rock star now.
Yeah, we all have to do it,
Yeah.
like Sinatra my way. I don't even sound like. Can you hear me out there? Okay.
Oh, now it's working.
Oh yeah, now I can hear. I couldn't hear myself. You need one of those speakers like they use in. What I want to do is talk a little bit more broadly about the theme this year and some of the work that I've done over the last 30 years. I direct the American West Center now, but I'm proud to say that I
began working there in 1988, quite a long time ago. And at the American West Center, what we do is public history. And public history most often comes down to telling stories about specific communities that are meaningful to those communities. And I think that's the key. And peril and conflict is inherent in that process, in anybody doing community-engaged work. The struggle over control of the past, the interpretation of history, illustrates its power. It's inherently political, and we'll find that kind of peril and conflict. We also find it within the historical profession. As Ben just pointed out, part of doing community-engaged work and taking community seriously is ceding authority. It's what, in the buzzword in public history over the last couple of decades has been shared authority, letting go, allowing that community to be an equal partner in the production of that history. That is an uncomfortable feeling for a lot of historians and a lot of my colleagues, and I've taught at 3 different research universities. It's not something that's taught, it's not something that they're used to doing, and it scares a lot of people. But you have to take that seriously. Much of my work has been with Native peoples. Many of the projects have been done specifically for those tribes, the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, Big Sandy, Rancheria, etc. And they were done to produce histories to support litigation or to support sovereignty. Other projects I've done have been more really focused on a general interpretation of the past. Some of I've been doing now for the National Park Service. In most of these cases, oral history is the central methodology. It's the way in which a community can really express itself. People can tell their stories. And in these projects, I've conducted oral histories, in some cases that are focused on a theme, an oral history project. We did one on Great Salt Lake. We've done oral history projects on veterans, on the University of Utah, on outdoor recreation in Utah, and so on. And all of these are focused on creating essentially a primary archive. It's to produce a primary source that's usable beyond yourself. It's about recording that community, and other scholars down the road or interested members of the public can access these. So it's not necessarily focused on what you are doing. In other cases, I have done oral histories to support other projects that I am doing. A good example was the water history I did for Big Sandy Rancheria, which is a small native community in the foothills of the Sierra. It's above Fresno, California. And they wanted to make a water claim against the state of California. And so I wrote a history for them documenting their use of water, focused mostly since the period since the gold rush, since 1848. And in that process, I interviewed a number of tribal elders, a couple of them in their 90s. And in that sense, it was oral history to recover stories and perspectives that had never been recorded before, but were essential for documenting the larger story of water use. Of course, community studies can be done in different ways. You don't have to only use oral history, but it's, again, I think, the most rewarding and the clearest way in which communities can tell their stories. Now, one of the questions that always comes up, and one that David posed early to the panelists, was, why does local history matter? What is the broader value of a local history, a local group? And of course, the theme of our conference this year is local matters. The first thing I want to say to answer that question is to play devil's advocate and say, does there have to be a broader value to a community story? Good public history is local because it serves the needs of a community. It answers questions that they want answered. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to ignore larger themes. We'd be poor historians if we did. The outside influences on any community are critical for understanding that community. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is the local story is important in its own right, and that members of the community must be able to see themselves in that story at the end. They are not simply a case study. And that's one way in which, I think we see a division between what's sometimes called academic history and public history. Within the profession in the 1940s, early 1940s, the American Historical Association split. right? Because a lot of the people who were university professors did not see eye to eye with the people who did local history. And that, from that split emerged the American Association of State and Local History, the AASLH. That's where that came from. And I've run into that division really ever since wherever I've taught. I've seen that division still remains. When I was at Colorado State University, I taught a course that was titled State and Local History. And I retooled the name. That was what it was on the books as, but I would always call it community history. And the emphasis was always on that community, on the members of that community being able to see themselves in that story, the end result. That was the first rule. But with that said, local stories can enrich our understanding of broader events, and they should not be thought of only within that bubble. I'm not suggesting that either. Another question that comes up a lot is, what do you owe a community? I think Ben and Beth both addressed that. Since I work with Native peoples, that's a critical question. For many years now, hundreds of years, Native people have been approached and had things taken, or they've been asked for things with nothing in return. And something you simply cannot do, certainly not these days. And so on the level of doing a project that supports tribal sovereignty, where I am essentially an employee of the tribal government, the benefit is there, it's visible, right? That report is going to help them. But there's other ways, and I think the owing the community extends well beyond tribal communities. Any local community, we owe it to them to approach them for their own sake, not simply as an end to research meetings. That's what Ben, I think, closed with about the tenure process. It's not something just to help your career. You have to always keep that in mind. And you should never set out on a project intended to set a community's perception of the past straight. You need to record their view of their history. Now, whether that jives with the way historians have interpreted the past or will in the future is not important at the moment that I'm collecting oral history. What's important is to document their perception. And that brings up another common question, and that is, what happens when your research might challenge a community's perception of the past? What happens when it doesn't jive with what they want or what they need? And of course, the quick answer is that as a historian, we have rules, we have ethics that we have to follow, that we can't violate. Carol Hammond, a well-known figure in the local history movement, teaches at the university level, and in her textbook on local history, described the way in which local communities could mask history or hide documents and do all of these kinds of things when a familiar and comfortable interpretation of the past appeared to be challenged. I've never experienced that outright, but I have seen very diverse opinions within a community of their own history. And again, trying to document them as fully as possible without bringing my judgment into them, at least at that point, is critically important. Also, at the legal level, I owe it to a tribe if I'm working for a tribe, and this is a report for treaty rights or any kind of sovereignty issue, to tell them everything. Bring them news, the good and the bad. I would be acting irresponsibly, unethically, and hurt them if I did not, because there is going to be somebody on the other side doing the research, going over that same ground. And if I don't come to them with everything, even the evidence that doesn't support their position, I am doing them a disservice. I'm setting up for a fall. And in fact, years ago, the Shoshone-Bannock tribes had a tribal attorney who was very wise on these matters, and we had a code word. She would always ask me if there were any heartburn issues. Things that we have to be aware of, things we have to know about. And that was an important approach. And finally, just want to address the insider-outsider question in telling community stories. Ben certainly addressed that, and Beth as well. But this is one of the things that I deal with a lot. I am not a Native person. As far as I know, I don't even have a Cherokee grandmother back there somewhere. It's fine to worry with you.
Everyone has that.
Yet I've worked with tribes for almost 30 years now. Being an outsider has some advantages in interpretation. It has advantages in being able to piece together a larger picture. But it also has some really real disadvantages when it comes to working within a community. And sometimes it takes quite a while to build the trust necessary. Working for a tribal government makes a big difference. I'll be honest about that. That the fact that you are there working for the government, working for the people, is much more of an in with people. That doesn't mean I haven't experienced people being very suspicious of me, of my motives, of what I'm doing at that point. But having tribal council members there and other people there to vouch for you or to sit in on the interviews certainly makes a difference. Ultimately, what you have to do is build trust. Right now, I'm doing a project for Pipe Spring National Monument in extreme northern Arizona. Many of you might know where Pipe Spring is. And in 1866, there was a raid there, and Navajo people took part in it. And the park is fully documented Paiute history, but they needed an understanding of the way Navajo people interpret those events. And so I've been, the last couple of years, trying to build trust and to interview people who have family stories going back to the 1860s. And it's like searching for needles in a very, very large haystack called the Navajo Nation. But once you find that needle, you also have to build trust with that person, with that community. And that is an ongoing commitment. And you have to take it slow, and you always have to tell yourself, there's a benefit for the community, make that clear to them. You always have to keep them in the forefront. And take time. Realize that, you need them. They don't need you. No, leave it at that.
So I want to give our panelists just a few minutes to address any issues that came up, a conversation between themselves, if anyone would like to jump in on that.
I'd like to build on, just illustrate one of Greg's points about what do you do when you gather data that may contradict a narrative that you know exists in the community. And so could you go to slide 4? Is there like a really boring chart there? Not yet? Going back to this presentation I made early on at the Kalama Mohalo Foundation, I threw up this slide. Is it up there now on the table? There's only a handful of deeds from the Osepa settlers in the LDS Church archives, and I located those, and I put the slide up to this group of descendants and kind of showed them these names. And after the presentation and the question and answer, one gentleman came up to me. His name was George Sadowski, and he said, "That first one on your table, Mahoe, that's my great-grandfather." And I was like, "Oh, well, tell me more." And this became the beginning of a wonderful relationship with the whole Sadowski family. If you go to the next slide, actually, I think you probably have to click it twice because I had animated. Is there a picture of a group of people? That's the Sadowskis. George and Stan and Mike and their spouses and daughter. And so every year that we were out there excavating with the students from SUNY Potsdam, we always had a day when we opened the excavation to the public so they could come see what we were doing and learn about Yosepa. If you go to the next slide, the first year we were doing this in 2008, we had come across a privy, actually, a filled-in privy that the Mahoe family had filled in right before they abandoned Yosepa in 1917. And we purposely left some of the deposits there unexcavated so that we could be pulling things out for the public, right? This thrill of discovery. And sure enough, so the Sadowski family comes out, they're excited to see their ancestors' property and some of their ancestors' things that they had thrown away. And if you'll hit the slide, then the first thing that came out that morning was this bottle. Is that on the screen now? And hit the slide one more time. The remains of the label just happened to be enough preserved that you could read what that was. And it was a bourbon bottle. And I was beside myself. I said, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I said, I could hide this like Greg was saying, just like, this never happened, or I could be honest. And this is one of those principles, right, where you as a researcher have your ethical commitments, but also your commitment to the community to be honest. And there's a number of ways you can interpret this, but I was nervous, right? But ultimately, I just took it over there and said, Sadowski family, I don't know what to make of this. Maybe you can help me understand it, but this just came out of your ancestors' privy pit, and it's a bourbon bottle. And they just looked at me with a big smile on their face and said, oh, Ben, we knew Grandpa liked his liquor. And I was like, oh, good, good. Problem solved, right? So that's a fun story, but it does illustrate one of these, you do find yourself in these sticky situations where you don't know necessarily what the right course of action is, but honesty is always the best principle. In that way, the roles kind of reverse. You become their informant, if you will, instead of them just becoming yours. One other quick thing on the slide there, other things came out of that pit that became very meaningful to the family. Is there another bottle there? This was just a broken glass fragment. We didn't think anything of it when it came out of the ground. When we cleaned it back in the lab, we noticed that it had an embossed patent date on the bottom heel of the bottle. If you click the next slide, thanks to Google patent search, which is wonderful, we were able to identify that this was a nursing bottle fragment. And we had done enough work with the Sadowski family to understand that they had something like 9 children born to them in Yosepa, and here was the remains of a bottle that was feeding one of their great-grandfathers or grandmothers there, that was born there. And that was one of those wonderfully tender moments where the past and the present connected in a very real, tangible way, and the value of this relationship that we had built really, it was just a perfect moment of bliss, if you will, where they got very emotional. We all got very emotional because this was a tangible connection to their heritage, to their ancestors, and to this very special place to them. So it's not always bourbon bottles that come out. There are some good things too.
Other bottles.
Other bottles.
Can I say something? Yeah. Okay, so a couple things. Are we good?
Yeah, we are.
Okay. That really emphasize what both Ben and Greg have said. First of all, one of the things that I think is very valuable about oral history as a form of local history and as a form of public history is actually not simply looking for stories and facts, but instead asking for analysis, asking people to interpret their experience for you. And I think that's helpful because I think it's empowering, but I also think for them, but I also think it's helpful because these people know a lot more about what they're talking about than you do. That's why you're there. And I have been I've been very lucky in gaining a lot of insight into my topic, into what happened here locally, into what the gay community went through and what it was doing and how it was negotiating with the dominant community, through simply asking people very open questions about, like, well, how did that make you feel? Or what did you think that was about? And so that's one thing to realize, is that your narrators have very strong analyses of what happened to them and what they witnessed. And those analyses are interesting and valuable and will inform a lot of, or should inform a lot of, what you end up arguing about, in your project. And I also, both Ben and Greg have touched on this, but there's a sort of way that you hold yourself in oral history, or at least a way that I hold myself in oral history, that kind of, it projects respect and humility and affection, which is kind of weird because you don't know these people particularly well. Often this is the first time you've met them, but there's almost a social work, my partner is a social worker, but there's almost a social work sort of active listening piece where you really want to project how much you appreciate that they are taking the time to talk to you about what they experienced. And that you're interviewing disparate members of the community who often hate each other, and you can't take sides, and you can't discount, you hear somebody talking to you and you know that directly contradicts what somebody else said. You can't let that, you need to respect the interview while it's happening, and you need to respect each of your individual interviewers. Even though you may know some really nasty stuff that went down that they participated in. And so that's another sort of, there's a really interesting way that you hold yourself in oral history. It's exhausting, actually, right? So all of the manuals tell you, 2 to 3 hours max on an oral history, and they're right. It's not just because the narrators get tired, it's because you get tired because of your very, very active listening. And there's a way that you need to balance your knowledge with theirs, right? And this gets to the issue of humility that both Greg and Ben were talking about, which is that we do know a lot as academics about very small things. And we think we know big things. We don't actually really know big things, but we're taught to think that we know big things. And there is a way in which you need to balance your expertise, which a lot of your graduate training is encouraging you to inflate. Right? And say, you are so important and you understand these things in a way that other people don't. You need to balance that with the kind of knowledge and analysis that your narrators bring to the project, because they also know a lot. And in fact, they often know a lot more than you do, right? I mean, that is part of the academic training process, is to give us either the confidence or the ability to project confidence so that we are authorities. And teaching has been very helpful for me in figuring this out, right? Because when my students ask me a question I don't know the answer, I just say, I don't know the answer. Do you want me to make something up on the spot, or do you want me to look it up? And usually my students will say both, right? They want me to make something up, and then they want me to check in with them, and I do. I'll go ask Greg some question that I got in class, and then we'll see whether or not my expertise and my educated guess about something I didn't know was right? And often it's not, right? Often I don't have the right answer, and I show that to my students. And I think that that's very helpful, right? To understand that you do not have all the answers, and that your graduate training is heading in one direction that really produces a kind of myopic arrogance that you need to actively undo when you are doing local community history, when you're doing oral history. Finally, the insider-outsider thing. I'm actually an insider. I'm gay. I worked in HIV activism in New York in the 1980s. I was kind of ground zero for the epidemic. I was in northern Manhattan from 86 to 90 when the wheels were coming off the bus, when thousands and thousands of people had already died and thousands of more people were sick. ACT UP was just getting started, so there was a lot of yelling, which was fun. But I also am not always an insider, right? First of all, I'm younger than most of these people by either a generation or half a generation. I'm a woman, and one of the things that I find fascinating in the history of sexuality more generally is the idea that the gay and lesbian community are a community because they don't actually always share interests. Or needs, right? So if you think about it from a legal perspective, the biggest issue for gay men legally before Stonewall and even through Stonewall into the 80s and 90s is the issue of public sex, right? People getting arrested for having sex in parks and bathrooms and stuff like that. Lesbians do not have this problem. This is not something that they do. Well, actually, that's not true. They do that. They don't get busted for it. But lesbians have legal problems, and they're almost always related instead to child custody. Right, so why is this a community, right? And that becomes very clear and there are ways that I have to position myself in relation to my narrators so that they understand that I understand that I am both an insider and an outsider with them. And insider status is enormously helpful. And this is a project about Utah, which means that most of my narrators are white. And many of them are middle class, and so that means that we share those identities as well. But for example, I almost always with gay male narrators have to position myself in terms of what I think of promiscuity, right? Because that's just a thing in the gay male community. Is part of in fact, actually rethinking what sexual relationships mean is something that the gay community has actually brought to the broader community, although the broader community often doesn't want that, but that's okay. And so I often need to sort of say that
happen to think that promiscuity can be fun if done responsibly. And, I need to position that because when you're talking about AIDS, you have to talk about sexual practices, and you have to acknowledge, and I would argue project, that you are not squeamish and that you don't think what they're doing is gross or immoral or yucky. And as a lesbian, they can't assume that about me, because there are plenty of lesbians who do think that, right? And so I need to sort of position, and there's usually some joking that goes on about it, or I make a smart-ass remark, and that sort of opens that up to say that they are open, that I'm open to have them talk about these things, and talk about them within a gay cultural context, as opposed to a mainstream or straight cultural context where sexual values are different. And where what we do and what we say often do not connect. I mean, that's another thing I would say about the gay community, is that we are often much more open about the ways in which what we do and what we say and what we believe in terms of sexuality actually line up more than they do. I mean, the straight community values monogamy, but we know from the data that that is honored more in the breach than it is in reality. And so I think that even within an insider perspective, there are pieces of you that are outsider and that you need to acknowledge, particularly if they pertain to what it is that you're researching, what kind of stories you're asking people to tell. And you need to figure, and I mean, you often do this on the fly. Right? It's not like you thought of it ahead of time and you're like, okay, so when promiscuity comes up, I'm going to say this, right? More like you're in the interview and you realize that there is a barrier for them honestly talking about an issue until you present your position or your openness about it. And I think that translates into a lot of different community settings. The content is different, but the insider, outsider, and your ability to communicate your openness to any truth, right, that they want to tell you, is something that you have to do.
Thanks, that's great. I know we want to have questions for the audience, but very briefly, I do want to address the question of interpretation. I just want to emphasize that storytelling is interpretation, and oftentimes your oral history narrators, they don't think about it that way. And in this project I've been doing with Navajo Nation and the Park Service, I've had people say, well, what I say is not going to jive with what somebody else says. And I have to assure them that really doesn't matter. I want to understand how these stories were passed down through generations. And your analysis does matter. It also gets at this question of where is storytelling at in communities. And we often hear these laments that we don't do that anymore. And in Native communities, it certainly is there. I did an interview just last Thursday in Page, Arizona. And one of the things that the woman I was interviewing said is going to stick with me for a long time, and I'm going to use this quote every time I talk about oral history from now on. She was talking about the fact that younger Navajos are not learning stories the same way, and that she was lamenting the fact that she had not done that as well as she should have. We often hear this, things were always better in the olden days, and there's some truth to that, in the sense that we're kind of in 140 character age, but I don't know if you heard Twitter's going to go up to 280 now or something like that, so double the content. We don't know what that's going to lead to. Anyway, one of the stories she told was about a time when Navajo people were subject to slave raiding out of New Mexico, going back to the Spanish period. And the story of this young Paiute boy that was living with them at the time, he had this red shirt on that they always remembered, and another young woman were taken captive, and they escaped, and they walked all the way back to the area of Black Mesa. And she said, we always pestered our mom for that story. We would always go to her and say, tell us that story again, even when she was in her 80s. And she said to us once, you kids should know that story by now. By the second or third time I tell you that story, you should have memorized it. You need to make it your story. And that's going to stick with me. I think that was an incredibly telling, analytical moment about oral history and storytelling. And it made me feel better, because I said to her at this point, you are the one doing that. Even though you don't think you are, at this point, you're carrying that on. And so even if a lot of people are tweeting these days and not telling stories, I think that there are community members everywhere who are the keepers of those stories.
Thanks. So you've been very patient. We only have a few minutes, but I'd like to open it up to people from the floor. If you would stand up, we've got a couple of folks with microphones. You can stand up, introduce yourself, we'll get a mic to you so that this can be recorded. Steve, come here front.
Each of you, in your own way, implied the necessity of dialectics in the process of researching, insider, outsider, in an academic, participant. Anyway, so I'm wondering. So often we have this notion of that research is a linear process, and I wish I would like you to reflect on the kind of necessity and how integral dialectics is in the discovery process, not just for local history, but virtually almost every kind of academic research that we do. I won't do the global part of your question, but I can share another story from Yosepa that illustrates something that Elizabeth and Greg and your question gets at too, which is the dialectics involved in the analysis or the interpretation, and how this is very real to me. Can you go to slide number 9, please? Will you define the word, please? Dialectic. It's this give and take, if you will, right? That the circular process where you're sharing, they're sharing, and in that sharing, we come to knowledge. Is that a fair?
So in some ways coming from dialogue,
there you go.
right? Yeah. The word dialogue meaning that it is an exchange, not a one-way communication, and that you shape, what you say shapes how they respond to you, and how they respond to you then shapes how you respond.
Excellent. So other things that came out of that pit at Yosepa were lots and lots of their broken dishes. Some of them were not so broken, but we pieced these all together, and we noticed a pattern, the students and I, as we pieced them all together, that all of the tablewares, these plates, were plain white, no decoration, and all of these, we traditionally in archaeology we call them tea-wares, were decorated. And I was trained at University of Pennsylvania, a lot of colonial American archaeology, and when you see a pattern like this with Anglos, you start to you think of concepts like conspicuous consumption, that this is Anglos displaying their wealth with the types of dishes that are used in public settings. Okay, when you have someone over for tea. So I wrote this up in a little paper, completely mistaken, right? Completely incorrect from my own Anglo-American bias. The only good thing I did was I shared it with some of the Sadowski family, because this was their ancestor stuff. And thank heavens that there was one of them that trusted our relationship enough to say, Ben, that's a load of hooey. They said, that does not make sense, and that is not what our people do. And I said, oh, I said, well, what can you tell me? And he's like, that's not right. Try again. I'm like, okay. So I went back to I went back to ethnography, actually, and I went and studied more of anthropological studies and discovered something quite interesting about Native Hawaiian culture, which is, it's almost the exact opposite of conspicuous consumption, that they display their nicest things for their community, not so they can show their friends how wealthy they are, but because it's a way to honor and value the relationship that they have with that person. So they're going to bring out their very nicest things for that person because they want to show how much they value that. When I rewrote it with that analysis and that interpretation, sent it out again to them, then it was like, you got it, Ben. That makes sense. That's the kind of story that resonates with us and our people, our culture. So it was a very much a dialectic process, and I'm grateful for that.
Well, I just want to say one thing very quickly, and that is oral history is always a shared process. Every interview is generally better than the last because you learn from the person you interviewed before. And I don't know how many times I've longed to go back to that first interview and do it right because of what I've learned from the other people.
Another question over here?
question is for Elizabeth. I think it's well known now that the youth suicide rate in Utah is nearly triple now what it was a decade ago, and suicide is now the leading cause of death among youth, 10 to 17 in this state. And there's, I think, an abundance of anecdotal evidence, at least some empirical evidence, to suggest that this problem touches the gay community. They're more vulnerable to this problem. My question for you, well, I guess talking on what you were saying, if AIDS was the public health crisis of 30 years ago in the gay community, suicide maybe seems to be the public health crisis of today. And my question for you is, what lessons can your research teach us about the dialogue that should be happening or needs to happen between the gay community and the dominant or more Mormon community to lead to hopefully better outcomes in this area?
Yeah, it's fascinating, actually, and this gets to your question about dialectic as well, although I don't know that historians would call it that. I think we call it triangulation or basically finding verification from one source in another source. So I have been hearing through oral history, but also through my archival work, a lot about suicide. And there were sort of 3 data points that really surprised me. And the first one was that Affirmation. So Affirmation is the gay Mormon support organization, and their papers are at the archives at the U, and I'm going through them with a research assistant, and it's like we're looking at an Affirmation newsletter from like 1991. So the epidemic is just going up and up and up, and the rates are doubling and doubling and doubling. And the Utah AIDS Foundation is like barely staying above water because they have so many new clients that they're trying to provide services for. And in the Affirmation papers, there were more discussions and groups, like announcements of meetings about suicide than they were about HIV prevention. And I was like, in 1991, like, are you serious, people? But then I thought back to an oral history I conducted with Bruce Barton, who was the head of the MCC, which is the gay church, right? And he was the pastor of the MCC in Utah during the epidemic. And I did two days of interviews with him in Oroville. And he said when he first started hearing about HIV, it was because these young men were dying in their congregation, and that they initially thought it was suicide. Right, so his initial diagnosis of the epidemic was not a new infection, but instead this ongoing epidemic of suicide. And what I came to realize, and I had another data point that also supported that, and what I came to realize was that suicide was this ongoing long-term epidemic in the gay community. I don't think just in Utah, although I do think there is evidence to support the idea that it is a much more serious epidemic in very conservative places. That AIDS then came through, and then suddenly we had 2 epidemics. We had an epidemic of suicide that AIDS was interacting with, and then we also had this epidemic of HIV/AIDS. And so that was fascinating to me, right, to realize how long-term this was and how long it had been going on, and then that it is going to be interacting with this other public health disaster. In terms of what we do about that in dialogue, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that AIDS does is it forces people to redefine community and realize that there are people who they thought of as outside their community, homosexuals, who are actually coming from inside the community. And that therefore there may be adjustments that need to be made about the definition of community, but also about services. And I think that is one of the interesting pieces about homosexuality and to a certain extent AIDS, which is that everybody produces same-sex attracted people. I'm sorry, we do. That we just do. And so everybody at some point will have probably a family member, definitely a friend, who has same-sex attraction and may begin to identify in that way as gay. And I think that is actually what is moving us forward, which is to say that gay people, and this here I need to sort of quote Margaret Toscano, who's another scholar up at the U, who said to me when I first moved here in the late 90s, she said, we're never going to get traction on the gay issue in the LDS community because gay people say we should. Because gay people are queer and debased and nobody should listen to them because we're immoral and all that kind of stuff. And that made sense. I'm like, yeah, no, they told me so. She said, but the issue is the issue of family and the issue of children. And that when you have a gay child, you may not like that you have a gay child, but you also do not want that child to die. I mean, there are very few parents who really want that ending to that particular immoral story of homosexuality. And so there's a way in which the fact that same-sex attraction is sprinkled throughout the population begins to break open ideas and discussions about who we are and who our people are and who we owe things to, and therefore what problems we need to try to solve. And what Toscano said to me is, it is the families of gay children who are going to continue this dialogue and have the most impact, right? And that's the mother dragon thing, right? Like there are organizations now that are mothers of people who are gay who are saying, we don't want to give up on our children. And if we think about this in terms of local versus national, I think that the LDS Church has a theological issue around homosexuality, because family is not just important now, it is important in the theology and in the eschatology, which is to say in the afterlife. And therefore, you really got to work this out. And it really does matter to people whether or not they can accept their gay children and whether they'll be reunited with them in the afterlife. Like, it's a problem. I don't know what's going to happen with that problem. But I think what's interesting is that as homosexuality becomes much more visible, it is causing problems that may be a little bit different than the problems that evangelicals face. Right, because evangelicals may not like homosexuality here, right, and may see it as a sin, and and whatever, however they don't like it, right? But that they don't have to then also think through what's going to happen in the afterlife, right? Because in the afterlife for evangelicals, for the most part, we just go and, I don't know, play a harp with Jesus or, something fun like that, right? And so we don't they're not promises about family reunification. There aren't, which, by the way, is one of the amazingly positive and I think appealing aspects of Mormon theology, right? Because who do we love? I mean, granted, we don't always love our family, right? And Thanksgiving can be kind of problematic, but we really do, right? That is where we are rooted, and that is one of the things about LDS theology that is so incredibly appealing, is that these loves that we have now will endure, and we will be able to continue to experience them. We don't always just have to love Jesus in the afterlife. We can also experience our love for the people that we're close to. And so I think suicide is one of those places where the rubbers meet in the road on this one. And I don't know what's going to happen, but we do seem to be moving more and more, because the gay community is pushing it, towards openness and towards therefore having to confront the cost of homophobia, not societally, but in our families.
A fascinating conversation.
Sorry.
We are unfortunately out of time, and the next sessions are starting soon. Please, I hope you can continue private conversations with our panelists, and through the sessions, picking up some of these things and talking to each other about community and how and why local matters. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking